Thanks for joining me here at my desk in the mountain village of Aulla in Tuscany, Italy. I'm Dr. Samuel Zinner. Today I'll be talking briefly about Philip K. Dick, Philip Kindred Dick. Born 1928, died 1982, author of sci-fi fantasy novels and stories that have been turned into several blockbuster films like Blade Runner with Harrison Ford. Came out in 1982, was a remake also with him in it. In 2017, The Total Recall with Arnold Schwarzenegger, Minority Report with Tom Cruise, Scanner Darkly, Keanu Reeves, Next with Nicolas Cage, and then Radio Free Albemuth, which was not a blockbuster, but I believe it's better than the other movies I just listed, and starring Scott Wilson, who had a key role to play in the Ninth Configuration movie that starred Stacy Keach. So, if one has followed the movies and followed the literature by and about Philip K. Dick, you'll know that in 1974, called it 2-3, right, for the month and the day. In 1974, unusual, strange events began to happen in Philip K. Dick's life. And many of these unusual experiences he then integrated into his sci-fi novels. And then, of course, they made their way into the movies I mentioned. All right, so the strange events began in 1974, and he died in 1982. So after the events, these unusual events began in his life, he began intensively writing, right? Tens of thousands of pages of notes, basically trying to figure out, find an explanation for how these unusual events of 1974 were possible. How do you explain them? So he explored every conceivable scientific theory, every philosophical theory, every religious theory, from a Hindu perspective, from a Christian perspective, from a Jewish perspective, from every possible angle of thought, right? He was trying to find an explanation. And then in 1982, 12 November, he tells us in these exegesis writings that he had what he calls a theophany. And he says, God manifested himself to me as the infinite void, right? But it was not the abyss. It was the vault of heaven. He was not some foreign God, but the God of my fathers, loving and kind. He had personality. He said, I am the infinite. I will show you that where I am, infinity is there. Where infinity is, there I am. And shortly after that, he continues writing that the ways to explain the strange events of 1974 are potentially infinite, and that in that infinity already you can detect God, who is infinite. Right. So he says that for 8 years, I'm paraphrasing, for 8 years, I've been losing myself in mind trips. Right. So today, he says, is the real revelation. That is, you can't get to the absolute truth. You just have to know that God is infinite, and so therefore beyond your understanding, which of course doesn't mean that we're absolved, right, from the attempt to understand. It seems to be of the nature of the human mind, So, but in any case, this theophany is the real end of the exegesis, right? What was it, 100,000 pages or something like this? And recently, a book of basically excerpts from all of these writings, these pages, was published with over 1,000 pages. And in any case, there are actually hundreds of pages that follow after this 1980 theophany. After all, he had a couple more years to live and write. However, what follows the theophany really doesn't pertain to the search for explaining or understanding the odd events of 1974. So the real ending of the exegesis, I maintain, is this theophany of 12 November 1980. And not too long after this, right, he starts to mention death quite a bit, as if he were expecting it, sensing its approach. Now, Catherine Hale, UCLA professor and a Dick scholar, I want to give a quote from her that I heard from the documentary The Penultimate Truth. And so this is about P.K. Dick. And you can find it, I believe, on YouTube. In any case, she says in there, if you believe, as I do, that people are aware of their impending death, they know they may be coming to the end of their lifetime, the need to find answers to lifelong questions and circumstances become especially pressing and urgent. And it's no mystery why Dick would take this process of projection, which has always been in his work, right, and find some kind of ultimate affirmation in it, that science fiction becomes the ultimate reality. Well, what more would a sci-fi writer need? Unquote. Well, let's try to approach the end of this brief series of my reflections on the exegesis. Let's fast forward to February 1982. All right, so just some months remain to P.K. Dick's life. I want to give a quote from February 1982. Quote, in a single vast stroke, my teacher, Sorer, my sister. All right, so Soror is the Latin, unquote, right? So Soror is the Latin word for sister. Now, to put this in context, Philip K. Dick was born with a twin sister who died in her infancy. And for his entire life, he was, as it were, haunted by her memory, by the presence of her in his memory. And he would fantasize, what would she look like if she had not died? And so he integrated her into much of his fiction, for instance. And it was as if she were his alternate self. And he was familiar with Carl Jung's psychology, right? So he would see her as his anima, right? As a feminine aspect of his psychology, of his being. And what's interesting here is he writes this Latin word for sister in Greek letters, right? My sister. And then continue the quote. O JHWH. What is that? That's the Tetragrammaton, right? The Jewish name of God, which pious, traditional Orthodox Jews do not pronounce, right? They will just say the letters, Yod Ke Vav Ke, right? Or Yod He Vav He, right? So, he then says, right, O JHWH, my sister. So he's amalgamating his sister with Adonai, right? With the Jewish God, well, with his God, right? He was not Jewish, but he was a Christian. All right, now, in the over 1,000 pages of the exegesis that have been published, there's probably 100 or even more, right, mentions of the Jewish Tetragrammaton. And he always, with one exception, this one, spells it YHWH. So he begins it with a Y, not with a J. And in a 2019 interview, his widow, Tessa Dick, informed me that P.K. Dick had an aversion to spelling it, to spelling the Tetragrammaton with a J, right? He knew it was incorrect. Y, right, is the correct spelling in English. All right, so he continues this quote with, I meant to write Savior. Well, what's that about? Well, he's alluding to the Greek word for Savior, which is soter. If you take out the tau, the T, it sounds a lot like the Latin word for sister, soror. So again, he is seeing his sister as a Savior, as the Lord. So where does the J come from here in JHWH? Well, his sister, his twin sister who died in infancy was named Jane, right? So the first letter of her name is J. So here he's amalgamating the name Jane into, right, basically the English version of the 4 letters of the Tetragrammaton. Later, shortly after this, he writes sister. He who comes to me as my sister who died. So again, he's amalgamating his sister with God. And he says, what does this mean? The ultimate restoration of what was lost in his personal life, of what was lost. For I am building a new heaven and a new earth. So I don't know how much more can really be said after such a profound entries from the exegesis. So I'll leave it there. I'll just say, if you find anything of interest in this brief talk, please consider supporting this channel. Thank you.